Rise, renew, reconnect. Welcome to From the Ashes, a podcast where every story ignites hope and healing.
And the fire in the darkest night, the phoenix burns. It's ready for flight. Shadows may come, try to tear you apart, but you're the flame that ignites.
All right, everyone, welcome back to From the Ashes. I am your host, Valerie Huang Beck, and today I have a wonderful guest with me. Her name is Dr. LouAnne Boyd, and she is an assistant professor in computer science at Chapman University. Her research interests center on the design, development, and evaluation of novel technologies to support neurodiverse populations. Her current projects investigate new interactions across two design frameworks she created, and the first is based on neuroscience theories to accommodate sensory impairments by designing technologies to increase accessibility of information and social connection for people with autism, ADHD, social anxiety, or dyslexia. Mouthful, but we're going to get into that. The second is using technology design principles to extend beyond awareness of neurodiversity to celebrating neurodiversity. You ready for this?
I'm ready. That is a mouthful. Let's break it down.
All right. Welcome, Dr. LouAnne Boyd. Yay!
Thank you so much, Val, for having me on here. I'm really excited to dig into this story.
Yes. When I saw you speak at Speakers Institute the other week, I knew that I had to have you on. Your anecdotes and your experience really spoke to me. And I've been learning my own journey of how to find compassion for my more diverse audience, more diverse population in the world. And the more I learn about, just people, the more I realize we are living in very, very different lived experiences. So yeah, let's start off with that.
Sure. So,
Yeah.
as you mentioned, I was a therapist before a computer science professor. So those are two different sides of your brain. So let's talk about how I hopped from one to the other. I was interested in psychology from a young age. My sister has disabilities. So I grew up kind of as the big sister protecting her and just being very compassionate and very sensitive to how people talked about people with disabilities. And so I majored in psychology in undergrad and went on to get a master's in counseling and worked at Hopkins at their behavior unit with kids and adults with developmental disabilities. And so I love this work. It's the kind of work where you either love or hate your job day one because it takes a lot of heart work. It's a very emotional work and it's not for everybody, but I absolutely loved it. And so I spent many years there working inpatient and then outpatient. And then had some things happen in my life, particularly a fire that burned my apartment to the ground. And so I took a moment back and said, where do I want to go next? And I felt like the universe was saying, you have no baggage. Literally, you have no bags.
Mm-hmm.
So go everywhere you want. So I moved from the East Coast, where Hopkins is in Baltimore, to the West Coast here in California. And I picked up doing the same kind of work I had been doing as an autism therapist. At this point, I was working in schools. I had worked in homes with children under 3, families that were recently diagnosed, kind of helping them navigate the space of dealing with a child that may not develop the way you expected or anticipated, and kind of how to get through that and not only survive it, but kind of how to thrive with this new adventure that you're on. And I did that work for about a decade, and then the coolest thing happened. I met a professor from University of California, Irvine, Dr. Jillian Hayes, and she was looking for classrooms where she could deploy technologies that she was building for kids with autism. So I was like, oh my gosh, autism technology, what is this? This is a whole new space. And so we started working on projects together. She would have PhD students and they'd make a new project for their PhD and they'd need places to deploy it, to test it out, to use it with actual users. And so I became somebody she would consult with to talk about like what designs might work here, or what do you think from your perspective as a clinical person? And so I fell in love with that work. And one day I found myself not feeling like I was growing anymore at my job. Kind of a couple things came crashing down at the same time for me. One was that I was kind of frustrated that I had been there a decade and I still wanted to grow and bring new technologies or new therapies kind of to the school districts. And I don't know if you've noticed, I talk a little fast, but I kind of work at this pace too.
Uh-huh.
People just didn't want to keep changing and growing at that rate. There was kind of like, you've given us enough. Let us digest what you've given us. And I was like, no, we can't stop now. There's so much to do. So kind of hitting I was kind of topping out at that job.
Yeah.
And then I was really excited about this new technology because technology obviously is a way to amplify anything we do as humans. It does it quicker, faster, more efficiently, and hopefully better. So I was kind of really curious and being pulled in that direction. And I also got diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis
Mm.
at the same time. So my body kind of just came crashing down on me. And so it was that was kind of one of my hit rock bottom, kind of flaming out, kind of like I need to be doing something different. Clearly, in many different ways, my body's telling me to like start over. And so that was the time where I kind of made the leap and quit my job despite my husband's feelings about it, who now is an ex-husband. Uh, mm. I knew it was a path was meant to go down. So I started a PhD late in life in computer science, which is very different from psychology. But the area of computer science that I study, human computer interaction, actually overlaps with psychology quite a bit.
Mhm.
So I can bring kind of this 23-year career kind of into this space. And the woman I was working with, who became my advisor, Jillian, she she also did her dissertation on tech for autism. So she was very interested in my expertise because generally when you're a computer scientist, you have to go out and find an expert or someone with a lived experience and kind of like interview them and learn from them what to put into your design. But I was like, my own expert. I could learn the technology piece, but bring my own expertise and we wouldn't have to kind of outsource that. I could kind of
Yeah.
serve that role. So that was super cool. So I had recently, right before that, written a book about social skills for kids with autism.
Okay.
And my dissertation was going to be like, let's build these things that I actually just made mental models out of. That's how I made the initial leap.
Amazing. So I have so many questions for you, but I think the first one that I want to start with is centered more around the heart space of all of this because you have done so much work in this area and I can tell. And I have heard bits and pieces of your story before. I would love to dig into one of those. If you could tell the audience something that motivated you from that heart space, something that you witness as a autism therapist that really has driven the work that you do today.
Yeah. So one of the things I think why, why autism? And I think I talked about having that sister and being compassionate that way. But what I was finding in classrooms, and I was still in the therapist space, were a lot of these kids that had Asperger's syndrome, what it was called in that day, were really excluded and bullied by their peers. And nobody had an understanding because they weren't presenting like a severely disabled person. Yet society definitely was not reading their cues the way they were experiencing the world. And there's kind of this gap. And I could see through the gap. I could see where they were coming from and be like, wow, it's really not fair that people aren't understanding you. But at the same time, we've got to kind of meet in the middle some way. And so, I had so many experiences where kids were getting bullied or even getting expelled for behaviors that were just kind of self-defense. And it
Mhm.
was breaking my heart. And, it kills me. I don't quite know why it touches me so much, but I think it's just that the big sister in me.
Yeah. One of the things that really struck me in when you talked was you talked about the suicide rate, and I want you to just uh, tell the audience a little bit about that. And along with that, I have the question of like, I don't know if autism is over or underdiagnosed because I feel like there's a stigma around it and they don't want the diagnosis.
Yeah.
And that can really work against being able to help people. So can you just talk about some of that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, people don't see that people are autistic necessarily. They don't read them that way. They just read them as I used to actually do a training called, is it Asperger's or just S? Is he just an S? Because a lot of these high school teachers are like, this kid is just a punk. He's like talking back. And I'm like, actually, if you look at his file, he has Asperger's and the rates are way higher than we imagine. This is a normal part of diversity. It's something that's just been we didn't start diagnosing it a couple decades ago, but it's been always been part of our existence. And
Mm.
there's a great book called Neurotribes where they talk about, in the caves, when we were cavemen, people were autistic. This is part of, the normal diversity of human expression. But yet we make it to be such a weird experience for people. And so the thing I think that gets me is because people aren't identified as being, or even if they have a label, that others them, that makes them less than, that we've got this stigma around being different in a way that doesn't need to be there. It it leads to really, really high suicide rates. So one of the rates I quote a lot in my research is that people are 28 times more likely to commit suicide with autism as a teen than anybody else. That's staggering, 28 times more likely. And actually, people with autism are often more successful at committing suicide, not just attempts at suicide. So it's really kind of this desperate loneliness, outsider experience. And there's just the human in me just connects with that. Like that does not need to be. This is completely a misunderstanding. So knowing that these rates are just staggering, and they don't need to be there, and it's really about our own acceptance. It's about belonging, and these folks spend a lifetime trying to fit in, and that's just the wrong agenda. That there should be this way to be, and that's the only way to be. And anyway, so I've decided this is my life's purpose, is to change that and to change that messaging, and starting with awareness, like people
Yeah.
just being even aware that might be what's going on with your peer. Maybe he isn't an ass, maybe he has Asperger's, or maybe he's both. I'm not excusing all behavior, but I just think there's a lot of miscommunication, and it's not helping us as a society to not address it.
Yeah. So I'm going to tell a little bit of story that I actually told you a little bit of already that is going to show, I have a lot of ignorance in this area. It's not like I've spent a lot of time, and recently just really starting to realize like how prevalent autism is, and that it really does, it's everywhere. It affects all of us. And so I was in Japan recently, and one of my guests who identifies as on the spectrum, and this is when she actually told me, is that she observed that like a lot of, because we were on a trip for anime fans,
Mhm.
and she was saying how like almost one-to-one, I don't know if this is like accurate, right? But almost one-to-one correlation between those on the spectrum and those who are anime fans. And a light bulb went off in my head in that moment, because it changed the way that I saw everything. And not in a way of like, oh, all of a sudden I'm around people that are not like me, but it's like, oh, all of a sudden I'm around, like there are people around me who may be dealing with difficulties that I can't see.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it reminds me, and always I have to remind myself that people are living with their own struggle. And with autism, this is my opinion, but I feel like it can be very difficult because social norms are so strong. And when we can't follow them, society's particularly harsh.
Yes, yes, and particularly in Japan.
Mhm.
Yeah, as a communal society, that's really really, really important there. I only bring it up because I think I mentioned when we met that I recently did a symposium in Japan called Celebrating Neurodiversity. And the idea there was to bring some awareness about the autistic experience there, because the stigma is even higher. And so the rates I talk about here about suicide are even worse there.
Mhm.
And there's a lot less services there because they're just getting started. And so, and not that people don't have access, but generally there isn't a system to kind of support people. And so understanding, like, why are we this way? Why are we having to like exclude people just because they think differently? Like, actually thinking differently is wonderful, and it will actually secure our survival. So why are we shunning these people? And I think historically it comes from a place of just like, oh, that's different for me, therefore it must be bad. And kind of looking back and thinking of autism the same way we think about other identities that are different than ours. I mean, we've got a long history of racism. We have a long history of sexism. And now we have this history, the awareness of ableism, like just
Mhm.
being different from other people is okay. And even using the word normal, like that is a made up idea, right? That
Yeah.
nothing is normal. It's just average. And when did average ever become great? Like, should we
Right.
be above it? Like, why is that so good? So yeah, I think there's just so much work to do on so many levels. I'm so excited to get the word out about how to make it take off so that we can change these perceptions.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about how your approach well, one, how did you start off, right, as an autism therapist without the technology part in it yet? And then how did that evolve once you started integrating the technology?
So as an autism therapist, I was a behavior therapist. So there is learning science behind that. So it's very much back to B.F. Skinner. Like, here's how we learn. Learning science says, things happen in our environment. We make a record of it. We change our behavior based on the consequences. So we've got, so I use a lot of those therapies, and that's how we all learn. So they can be successful to a degree. But what I realized really early on, especially working with under 3-year-olds, is that, autism isn't a learning thing.
Mm.
And that's like, wait a minute, what? It's not a behavior disorder. It's actually a sensory disorder. It starts with like the input of information. So here we're like asking people to behave a certain way and follow social norms and all this higher processing stuff when the input is different, or the sensitivity to that input is different. And that's a game changer. So early on as a behavior therapist, I co-treated with occupational therapists and speech language pathologists who already got this. It was really the behaviorists, I think, that are late to the party in terms of understanding, like, if you can help somebody regulate and be in their body and be calm, you're going to get a lot more success. I mean, that is basic wellness, right?
Yeah.
And that is not the approach in some of these therapies. And so, or at least it wasn't, 20 years ago when I was a therapist, or a beginning therapist anyway. So then you bring technology into it, and this is where it gets scary. I was attracted to technology because the promise of making things better, like exponentially. Oh, you can't afford therapy? Maybe we can do something digitally, like
Mm.
the access to support. But also the chances that we're going to amplify the harms of it. If we're still assuming you're supposed to behave a certain way, and now we have
Mm.
you don't even have a human there with a heart that can mediate and use their self to kind of read when you're not quite ready, and kind of, all the things I did as a human. The potential of this to take off and to replace humans got really, really scary. And so that's kind of where I started to double down and make sure, I wrote a second book that's about making designers of technology aware of these sensory issues in autism and other neurodivergences, to make sure that they start at that place, that you're like, check the input before you're having these expectations of output. Because we walk around saying, oh, that person acts odd. We're like, at this behavioral level, we judge people at that behavioral level, but we don't know what's going into the system or how it's being, processed. And it's very similar to trauma, the work you would do. Like, you don't know what somebody's been through. It's very parallel to that. You could use that analogy, and I'm not even sure they're different,
Yeah.
honestly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, but I think, based on just my own observation of things, there is sometimes where the sensory input, sorry, gets to be too much in the moment. You can already tell when someone starts to panic, whether that be like in an autistic person, or if it's someone dealing with trauma. Like, I do find that the reactions can be very similar. And I think, as you as the therapist, like, you have experience of how to deal with that, right?
Yeah.
How can you explain that so that we as lay people can start to just be able to help those in that situation, maybe diffuse it in the moment?
Yeah. Wow. That's a really good question. So I think again, it's so the same as any wellness thing. It's like being aware of our own ego. So a lot of things that tip people off before someone might even have a meltdown. That's one situation. If they're just in a sensory overwhelmed situation on their own, like the environment's too loud, or the lights are flickering, or there's, something sensorially going on, people are already doing things to manage that. But what I find the most interesting is when they're interacting with people and the people are making it worse.
Mm.
Somebody says something and they're trying to regulate their own comfort, or even maybe their own understanding. They're asking for additional information, and the way they ask is unexpected, and it sets off the person. Like, I don't like your tone, or, that was rude the way you said that, or why are you rocking? Like, that looks odd. Like, we're reading it from our own perspective, and we're judging it, and we're, and it's really just a reflection of where we are as a person. Like, do I feel solid enough in me that that person can be them, and it doesn't matter if I'm having a conversation in public and this person is rocking, because that's what they need to do to regulate. It's not a reflection of me. So much of it is like about just checking our own ego.
Mm.
That's a hard message to tell people. Like, they're like, hey, I want to get better at this. And you're like, hey, check your ego. It's like, it's really, really tricky. And I haven't quite figured out how to deliver it without just using humor, really. Like, have you ever found yourself being, are you the jerk in the room? Basically, like, so that's kind of, I find, like, people are afraid to enter environments because they can't predict how another human's going to react to them. And then I think checking in with people to see if they're doing all right, like, something might be overwhelming. I mean, like you said, you can usually read somebody's body language and be like, wow, this must be overwhelming for you. But, inviting people to kind of move through life at their pace and just check and being okay with that and not having our own expectations. I find like the worst situations are our expectations of other people.
Yeah, yeah. And I think checking in with that with yourself, because like, even growing up, I remember just my mom would sometimes say, like, why are you reacting in that way? And it feels super disempowering when someone questions your own reaction to things. Because like you don't necessarily have it's not like you're trying to be difficult, right? And so like I think we've all experienced that to some extent of someone else being like, well, why are you doing it this way?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And how we shut down, that judgment just shuts us down. And then it's just a nightmare that's just a crumble from there. So I feel like when you get hit with that, when you have that instinct to be like, why are you acting that way? Like that thing that kind of ticks you off. Like to me, that's a trigger. If like some other human is making you feel that uncomfortable, whoa, wait, stop. That is obviously our own trigger, but then maybe stopping to think maybe something's going on with them. Like maybe they're wired a little bit differently. I used this example just with my friend on a hike this morning. We were talking about somebody at her work that said something really rude to her. And she was like, after like the fourth or fifth thing he said, it actually started to cross my mind. Maybe he's on the spectrum. And I said, you know what, if we thought about it like, say you were doing surgery with somebody and they're handing you implements to do the thing and you're not quite looking at them and they keep handing them to you the wrong hand. And you're like, why are you doing that? Why are you being so annoying? I'm left-handed. And it's like just being able to say, you're wired a little differently. Like I function better with my left hand than my right hand. Why are you giving me this thing? Like just that little shift. Like it's not a big deal to be left-handed anymore, right?
Mhm.
When I was little, they didn't make the scissors, but now they make the scissors and all the things. And so I think it's that shift of like, wait, why am I getting annoyed? If we can just recognize this is we're just talking two different little languages, we can quickly kind of accommodate and regulate with each other. And then it doesn't have to be a thing at
Yeah,
all. It's like a simple shift.
totally. And it takes a while, I think, for us as humans to catch up, right, over history of like adapting to the people who are different. Because I think in the past, what we did was we forced the left-handed people to just be right-handed.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Right. Yeah. You have to write left-handed. Everything's the margin on the paper. Everything is built for the right-handed world. And I think that's a great analogy. Everything's built for the neurotypical world.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I studied psychological services when I was in college. This was way back when, and I never went on to become a therapist. So I don't have the up to date, but I do particularly remember when I was in school, the language of neurotypical and neurodivergent did not exist.
Mm-mm.
And that wasn't that long ago. I was in college probably no less than 15 years ago. And yeah, and since then it has neurodivergence has become more of a wider, consciousness. But I still, because like, especially for me, I still know like it took me a while to catch up to that language. And so just even the concept of a spectrum, right? And the awareness that autism, ADHD, social anxiety, dyslexia, they are somewhat related. So I think for a lot of us, if you can dip into that, just explain to us what this spectrum is. Why is autism, ADHD, social anxiety, and dyslexia all considered on that spectrum?
Wow, that is $1 million question. Great question. So yeah, we had this thing called the neurodiversity movement happen in the 90s. And so I parallel this because I've been around for many DSM books, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. Like I started with the third edition. I'm an old lady. And now we're like in the fifth edition. Back then, it was just autism spectrum. Actually, it was just autistic disorder. So we didn't have a spectrum yet, realizing it wasn't always this severe end or kids that had multiple handicaps or disabilities, impairments, speech issues, maybe motor issues, like a whole host of things going on that anybody would recognize this person as having a disability. There was that. But at the same time, there was also my first DSM also being gay was in there as a disorder.
Mm.
So it was like, and so at that time, at the gay rights movement started, and people were like, this is not a disorder, this is just a difference. Sort of the neurodiversity movement rode on the back of that. And it's kind of been behind that all along. It hasn't really gotten to the foreground yet. But the idea of like, yes, disability is actually normal. It is actually part of diversity. It's actually part of the experience. It doesn't have to be less than, it doesn't have to be other, it doesn't have to be strange or weird or all the things we say about folks that have different sexual preferences or people that are different colors, like all the diversity that we have, this is just another form of that diversity. So why all those different disorders? I think disorders, we've got this idea that there's this normal average in the middle kind of thing. And these are wirings that are just fall outside of those norms. And so norms are just also made up numbers. Like it's just, it falls outside of the 50%. Or if you want to do 2 standard deviations, it's just that these ways of wiring are different enough. So you could almost consider anything neurodivergent if it's not the typical way of doing something. So say we measure reflexes and it takes, however many milliseconds to do some reflex and somebody does it slower or faster. The reflex comes from a neuron. Everything comes from a neuron that we do. So kind of anything you don't do in an average way can be considered divergent. And where that gets criticized or stigmatized is when it hits the social behavior or the cognitive level, like way up high where we're not, following norms. Again, like the average way people are supposed to respond or the expected way that made us all feel safe because we could count on people being on our side if they acted the way we expected them. They're not starting trouble if they're not like confronting us, and these kind of made up societal rules that we've used for centuries to keep us to feeling safe. And so yeah, I think that's how they get lumped there. And I think as the moves, more people are like, yeah, that's me too. Bipolar people are like, yeah, we're divergent neurologic. It's, these are synaptic, hormonal, neurotransmitter related things. I think they kind of draw the line when it's clearly just a sensory motor issue that doesn't really impact kind of behavior and cognition as much. But it's sort of arbitrary. It's kind of just this idea of like, there is all of this is normal. All of this is part of this expression. And so that's why you see it all lumped. Now, we are generally talking about autism when we do that. But to me, it's kind of the big 3, I would say, are like autism, ADHD, and dyslexia kind of are the first 3 people in line that are like, hey, yes, we are wired differently.
Yes, absolutely. So I have a tricky question to follow up with that, because I think in traditional Western therapy, we view disorders as disorders because basically they make us less functional in wider society. That's why it's called a so-called disorder. And so the whole idea behind therapy is to fix yourself enough in order for you to be functional, right?
Ah.
Which there is some problems with that framework, I think. And right now, I think what you've been advocating for is more of an approach of how can we change society and our ability to integrate different people who are wired differently, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Which
So
is a big challenge.
it's a big challenge. So like it's the autism, I think, even made it to the books. We made this DSM manual to decide what is normal and not normal to enlist people into the military. We needed to know that they were going to be stable. So we have to come up with this idea of labels, like, are they going to be stable when they're out there at war? So how do we know? So psychologists were tasked with, we got to like come up with these disorders. So that, like there was a specific function for having these labels to begin with, at least for the DSM. So you're right. When we do therapies to make people functional, to make them kind of be able to just do the things to get through daily life, there's a good part of that in the sense if there's a therapy that can help someone, say their tendon is too tight, and if we stretch it, they can put their foot all the way down and they're not in pain anymore. Beautiful. Awesome. Yes, we can rehabilitate or habilitate some of these conditions. But if we're changing people's behavior so that they socially fit in, then that's the place where I found the rub. And that's where it hit my work specifically, where, the idea that using a certain tone of voice is, being acceptable, that's all agreed upon and that everyone can do that flawlessly. And that if you're not doing that, that there's something wrong with you and that needs to be changed. And so I think the unfortunate thing is I think the people that came up with those rules didn't understand autism from a sensory perspective because it's really new. It's maybe just in this last DSM that sensory is even part of it, the sensory sensitivity. So there's like no acknowledgement that the input was different, but we were expecting the same output from people. And so, and then it was deviant not to have that output and that people were going to interpret you this way instead of just being like, once you understand the input is different, it's really, I think, pretty easy if you have a working heart to be like, oh, oh, you're left-handed. Oh, yeah, let's give you different scissors. So you're right. So much of the function is about, so much of therapy is about getting you functional. And so functional for what? Like, so you can get back to work after you come back from the war, so that you can meet other people, can make other people feel comfortable. And so like a lot of it is checking kind of what is the underlying purpose? Like, how does that improve that person's quality of life for real? Not just in the shallow, immediate, like, oh, it gets them invited to birthday parties. Like, is that like, again, it goes back to checking the ego of the person. And
Ooh.
yeah, that was the disillusionment. Like leaving therapy and going into technology, I was like, okay, I got to leave a lot of that behind. But then being like, oh my gosh, technology just amplifies all of that if we don't do it with very conscious design.
Yeah. What really struck me when you said that is I work with clients for personal growth and holistic wellness. And one of the things I often say to people is that your greatest strengths are also your greatest weaknesses. And now when you're telling me about how can, that being resilient and like being able to like kind of steal through certain things and being tough and all that has been ingrained in our society for a long time, that we accept that that is quote unquote normal because that's what makes us functional, maybe to go to war, maybe to do all these things. But what this also creates, I think, is we do create a society that is less sensitive to other people's needs, that values pushing through. And there is a cost to that, even to the people who are like that, is that there is a something experience that's missed out and a compassion that's also missed out on. So it's really interesting to see it from that systemic perspective.
Exactly. Like the underlying assumptions, like why do we think we exist? Are we here to, get a degree, buy a house, picket fence, 2.5 kids, like that's a plan, but it's not everyone's plan. But we proceed as if it is. And we like try to push them down that lane. And that's yeah, not everybody has to do that or wants to do that. And I I think you nailed it.
Yeah, which means that we are up against quite an endeavor.
Yeah, yes. 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 We need to band together.
Yeah. So this is a huge question. This is probably one that we will not be able to solve right now at all. But it is what our quest is right now, and what I see it as is that we are trying to shift the consciousness of society to be more readily to adapt to a diverse population.
Mhm.
Shifts in consciousness take something more than even just collective effort.
That is true. In fact, I think that's what's taken me this long to even get here. I started in this field thinking autism, wow, I people should connect socially. That's so innately part of being human. Like we need each other, we need to connect. And this is a condition that doesn't connect to the mass. And I used to go into the approach of like, it's an 80-20 problem. Like society needs to change, but I don't have any power to change society. So I'm going to put all my effort into helping the individual change. And if they could come 80% of the way, maybe society could come 20% of the way and accommodate and be inclusive. And then that shifted somewhere. And I got pushed on this by scholars and some other folks about why isn't it the other way? Shouldn't they only, they're the one that are the outsiders. Shouldn't they only have to come 20% of the way and society comes the other 80% of the way? And I'm like, yeah, I love that dream. I just have no idea how to implement that, especially as a single person out there doing this work. And now I'm at a point where I'm like, it doesn't matter. I have to just try. I just have to like get out there. That's why I took the speaking
Yeah.
course. I just need to get out there and start being like, nope, it's 80, and I don't even know if 80-20 is the right number, but I feel like at least for this epoch and humanity, like it seems like a lot more fair than doing it the other way. I feel like we've shifted out of the like it's 80% your responsibility to get yourself back to work and to pick yourself up and to, and society's only going to accommodate you. I'm at least trying to flip it to the other way around. That the individual can be who they are and maybe needs to put in a little effort, that we can all grow, but that society has to do most of the growing in this space.
I think another thing that comes to mind is that when we are more inclusive to other people, we are also more compassionate to ourselves because that includes all of us. If we can expand our acceptance of other people, we get to uncover the parts of ourselves that we've pushed down, that we've considered bad.
Yes, yes. And I actually think stigma, I mean, that's, I think, the root of it, where it comes from, right? When someone's bothering you, don't we always say that's a mirror of what's going on with you? Like, why is that so irritating to you? Like, that's a moment to check ourselves. So it's like not only being compassionate to that person, but being compassionate to us, because that's a moment of like, oh, wait, why is that driving me crazy? What is it about that? And so I got a little story right there that I'm being reminded of. So I was asked to do this symposium in Japan to put together a 3-day agenda with a colleague. And we were supposed to bring celebrating the neurodiversity movement in technology to Japan, introduce it to, a host of people there. And we were like, we want it to be fresh and something new. And already what exists is autism awareness. I mean, you've heard of April is Autism Awareness Month, and that's a thing. And inclusion and accommodations, that's the legal requirement. Like we have special education where we have to make adaptations for people with disabilities and things like that. So that's already a thing. And then I kept getting stuck on this idea of acceptance. Like just because, someone's different, do you actually accept it? Like maybe you've allowed them into the movie theater and you've given them a seat, but are you really actually okay with that? Like that's a bit of work I feel like we have not really, we've kind of glossed over. And so I feel like there's a space to do that. There is a lot of advocacy going on, groups that'll go out there and fight for equal rights or, awareness, and that work's important. But I felt like all of that exists. What am I going to bring to Japan that's new and fresh? The acceptance piece was a big part of it, but I'm like, how do I even elevate that once? What is ultimately the point? And I actually asked a colleague of mine, and he jokingly said, we should celebrate autism. We should and there already is this celebration, but usually it's just those things I mentioned, kind of being inclusive, meaning inviting somebody in, but that doesn't mean you're necessarily accepting them, or maybe accepting them, but really to celebrate this, like that seemed sort of absurd in the way he said it. But I was like, okay, actually, that's the thing. So we titled this conference that, and I'm like, how do I actually implement that? What am I going to do that's actually celebrating diversity across all of us, not just celebrating differences, but truly, honestly, what does it mean? Okay, meantime, I discovered that my mom's autistic. And this is the big aha moment. Like, oh my gosh, like, and then that moment she was actually driving me crazy because she has alexithymia, like an inability. And this is all recently learned for me, where she doesn't recognize or articulate her own emotions. She's never given me a hug. So there's been a lot, that's like the whole history of like why I think the compassion in me is like wanting to connect really comes from never connecting with her in the normal way. So here I am. I'm going to promote this celebrating technology in Japan, but I'm literally kind of repulsed by the way my mother treats me. And then having this realization that she's on the spectrum. She isn't going to do it the way I expected to, no matter how much I want her to. She's never going to give me the love I want, the way I want it, the way I expect it, the way society's told me I'm supposed to get it. She loves me in her own way, the best she can. And so that was the biggest, like, oh my God, like sometimes celebrating, like now what can I celebrate different things about her, but doesn't mean I don't have these other challenges. But that looking back at me, like that was that moment of like, I need to look at me. My expectation is this of her. And that's the wound in me. And so I feel like when we are repulsed or annoyed or disgusted by someone's behavior, like literally she'll do things that seem so cold and calculated and like just stabbing. And then like having this awareness of why it's coming that way. And then also reflecting why I need it. That is that inner work that I think being able to appreciate, wow, that is a very different wiring than mine. And I think it's here to teach us something.
Wow, that is really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And I think that really hits the nail on the head. I have to process that a little bit.
No, I sort of have these out of body moments where I just talk and I'm like, I don't know really what I'm saying, except I'm just saying it because it's kind of just like these experiences. They're here to teach us. So changing all of humanity. Like I think it starts with one story at a time and sharing the stories, like through things like your podcast.
Yeah. And I think just like knowing that everyone does have their own way of showing love and care can be huge, and that you don't have to have it a certain way. Right? Yeah. We're so bent on it being the way that we want it to be.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. And interpreting it a certain way,
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Like just all of it goes back to us and our ego and our expectation and our understanding. And so like I think your initial question was something along the lines of like, it starts with seeing it in yourself and recognize, so it's like celebrating, like really appreciating that she can be that way instead of writing her off as a bad mom, which I did for decades, appreciating like, you know what? She's bad at that thing that's neurotypical that I expected of her. Yeah, she is really bad at that. But that's not what she can do. She's left-handed, like she's left-hearted. I don't know. She's
Mhm.
it's going to look differently. And then, but she does these other things amazing. She's so creative, and she's given me so many other gifts. And yeah, I think if the world can start seeing that people are really, really, we are really diverse, but in the end, it's all there to help us grow and be better together.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to ask a slightly different question because I think I alluded to this before, right? But there has always been obviously like a stigma to
Mhm.
having autism. I feel like the more that we learn about each other, the less the younger generations have the stigma, right? Like the same with everything. But do you find that do most people, even if they don't they're not telling everyone, are they aware that they're different or are
Mhm.
do they yeah, so there's a whole bunch of questions I think wrapped up in that question. But yeah.
Well, there's this idea of self-stigma. So I think there are multiple buckets here. I think there are people that are aware and that are so ashamed they're going to hide it and mask and spend all their energy making sure other people don't notice it. And they're some of the biggest stigmatizers of other people
Mm,
spectrum. They're going to be the first to be like, that's bad because they're spending so much energy. And that actually is the scariest place for me because it comes off really toxically. Like
right.
they might, and yeah. And then I think there are folks that are really oblivious because I think there's unfortunately or fortunately, there's an overlap between kind of some autistic behaviors, like alexithymia, not like kind of acknowledging or understanding emotion, and then like kind of toxic masculinity. And those
Mm,
are very separate things. Toxic masculinity, bad, right? Autism, diversity. But there's this space where they kind of intersect. And I think until we get some clarity on what the difference is there, we're not going to have people really outwardly necessarily saying, yeah, I'm autistic. Except the younger generation really is great about that. Like you'll see TikTok, everybody's like, everybody's autistic. It's like, yeah, let's go there with that because like at some point being left-handed didn't become was is not stigmatized anymore.
right.
Like it used to, like instead of forcing people to be right-handed, we've gotten over that. And I use that because autism is probably as frequent as left-handedness. So it's like it's a
Yep.
nice, oh yeah, being left-handed is no flipping deal. You just tell people and except it's bigger than that because it's not just how you use your hands, but it is about wiring of the brain and if we can make those switches. So yeah, I think so. The stigma is super, super huge. So that's kind of my journey is how do we really get a grip and look at the big, big, big picture about why do we need people to fit into a box? Why do we need them to be right-handed? Why do we need them to behave a certain way? And if we can just kind of check in with ourselves and realize like it's all going to be okay and there's supports there to make it all work for everybody. It's going to be okay.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. All right, so I want to bring it back to your research and the technologies that you're working on. What do these look like?
I'm so excited.
Yeah.
So and this kind of loops back to the therapy thing about disorders and finding out, kind of labeling them so that we can get people functional skills and get them back functioning in life. So I have this dream that there's going to be a future where we don't have these labels, that we really look at things at the symptom level. We're kind of already there. And I think in Europe in the ICD 9, 10, there's more symptom based instead of having to have these actual clusters of disability. Like those again, like everything else, are made up. We had to draw a ring around it and say you're autistic if you're in this side, but you're not if you're just on the outside. It's like those limits are arbitrary. So let's dissolve those and look just at symptoms. And then get people support with symptoms. So you have a speech impediment and you want to work on it, you work on that. That's a symptom. That's not related to autism. I'm just using it as an example. Say whatever the individual symptom is, if we can break it down and realize actually the symptoms of autism occur, all of them across all people in some degree. And that doesn't mean everyone's on the spectrum. That's not where I'm going. It's just this idea of when you take away the actual silo that's around it and you let it go, those symptoms kind of are everywhere and we can see them in ourselves and we can start breaking down this idea that we're actually even that different, that we're the same in the sense that we're all super complex and have these
Mhm.
things. So my technology that I'm making right now is the idea that instead of using maybe a profile picture. Like right now, we are so focused on, and stigma is so much about how you look, how you sound, how rich you are, where you're from, how, if you're skinny or fat, blah, 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 all the things that we judge people on. We make these quick snap judgments about people. And where does this get amplified by technology? Social media. So
Mhm.
we've got these profile pics. Maybe they're glamour shots, maybe they're whatever. And that's great. And the mainstream is going to respond to that. But for the folks on the outside that might be judged by that, what if we could change the paradigm? Here's the zigzag. So instead of putting a profile picture, or maybe you have your profile picture and you can tap it and it spins around and there's an alternative like we do with the avatars.
Mhm.
Maybe it's a disco ball. And this disco ball is all these different brightly colored tiles, and each is a characteristic of you, and they're all in a positive light. They're all something sparkly about you. And we all have things that are sparkly about us. And so my use of technology is like, I'm going to break down stigma by showing like, look, you can be autistic or not autistic and have similar tiles on your disco ball. Like we have more in common than we have than we are different, right? And we can
Mhm.
start to appreciate, like, if you were to meet somebody, like you saw their profile disco ball before you ever saw them, and you realize they have like out of 1,000 things, they have like, oh my gosh, 32 of these are like exactly like me. Does it really even matter if they're autistic? Do you even need to know if they're autistic? Like if you know that you've got that common ground, because I think as humans, we will always stick to grouping by affinity,
Yeah.
like, and so I don't think we can change that. I'm not trying to change that. I'm trying to leverage that.
Yep.
Like if we're going to group like let's find how we're common, and then the other things become arbitrary. So I have an app that's a disco ball, and you fill out a survey. And right now I use it as icebreakers in my computer science classes, where kids get to know each other first by what they have in common and what they're really good at and what they can appreciate about somebody. And the folks on the spectrum could be really, there's a stereotypical set of traits like about being really logical and really systematic and all these things that are great things to have in a teammate. And you discover that first and you're like, I want him on my team. Instead of the other way around, you see him walk in and maybe you've made a snap judgment about him and you don't want to interact with him. So, I'm kind of leveraging social media, like flipping it on its head, I hope. Or at least I'm starting with profile pictures and Canvas and the, online learning platforms. But anyway, that's the start of it, kind of just changing the way we judge each other and
Mhm.
having this metadata that tells us something much more about our rich complexity, as humans and our to striving to get to the best place of ourselves we can.
I think that's great. And you know what is really wonderful about that is that app isn't limited to people who are neurodivergent. Like anyone can benefit from that.
Exactly. Exactly. That's why I want Facebook to adopt it. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's the idea. Is it never anywhere in there does it talk about even neurodivergence, disability, anything. It's just like, look at these things. So that is exactly it. Using mainstream methodology, like using what we're all there kind of promoting ourselves, like curating our profiles. And if we can use what we already do in a way to kind of learn more about each other in kind of a subversive way.
Yeah. What have been the results you've seen so far? Anything particularly interesting?
Yeah, I think I've only been doing it for a year, so it's a brand new paradigm that I've just put together. And only thing I've learned so far is that in computer science settings, when we do group work, which we do a lot of, or at least I do that in my classrooms, and I'd say maybe a little more than half students are introverted. Introversion, extroversion, another thing that we tend to prioritize, privilege extroverts, right? We're kind of set up that way. I came from the psychology world, mostly extroverted people, mostly women, and then I go into an introverted world, mostly male. So I've like done a lot of this paradigm shifting and being like, wait, in this world, we don't really privilege being extroverted, except for when you're in a small group and someone has to present.
Hmm.
So a lot of computer science classes I have found there's not necessarily a lot of group work or presentations because it's a lot of math or it's coding and it's very independent things or very things that can be delivered not in a verbal way. But I purposely do a lot of these combinations. So what I found so far is that nobody seems to care if somebody's autistic or not. They just want to make sure there's one extrovert in their group, like someone to do the project. Like we want one of those. So that extrovert could or could not be autistic. In fact, it's probably split half and half. So anyway, it's like breaking down the paradigms all over the place that people, they kind of know what works well and making being different kind of irrelevant or obsolete.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then seeing like finding the people who are going to be in your tribe, like who's going to be, I guess, complementary
Yes.
to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Like what makes a good team? That's kind of the question we're asking now is like,
Mm.
because we need a place to do this. like the disco ball as a profile picture on social media, that's a really big long-term project to measure and to figure out if it has any impact. And if it, do we ever ultimately change the suicide rates? I mean, that would be like the $1 million question. And I think it's going to be belonging. And how do you feel like you belonging? Where's a small unit of that I can measure? Small group projects in a classroom with actual people whom a quarter or more of are probably on the spectrum or neurodivergent in some other way. And directly measuring it and saying like, hey, can we just learn to form teams and communicate and be connected and belong in that space? That's the beginning.
Amazing. All right. Well, to close off our conversation, I want to ask you, what do you see as your role in the future of how all this develops? And what are you working on right now that you really want to share?
Yeah. So I think, I think by focusing on, we've already kind of broken the mold with the neurodiversity movement of autism being something we need to fix. Now it's going to be like, how do we go to doing my 5 A's, which are starting with the awareness and moving on to accommodating folks that need things done a little differently, like left-handed scissors, moving on from there to true acceptance. A next step would be moving on to advocating, that you get to a place where you're advocating for somebody who has a different need than you because it's just makes sense, the right thing to do. And then truly appreciating. To put all those things together, I want to do that not only in my technology through these celebratory technologies like the disco ball, but also public speaking, like getting out there and sharing this message about diversity, equity, and inclusion, like on bigger stages for mainstream audiences, just like the whole public, like spreading it out. So that's kind of my goal, is to do it not only in my professional life, but kind of extend it to have kind of almost like a side gig where it's like, I just feel compelled to go beyond kind of my classroom, my research, kind of just a bigger stage. And because I think it's a big message to get 80% of the world to change or for us all to change 80%, right? That's a
Right?
big, so yeah. So I'm going to probably be busy, hopefully.
Yes. All right. And then are there any resources that you can recommend, either your own books or otherwise, where people who are really want to start to understand more about neurodivergence can reference?
Right. I mean, I would go back and cite that Neurotribes book. That's just what's coming to the top of my head at this moment. And I mean, another great place is just the crowdsource information on TikTok. Honestly, there's so much great information there. I mean, when folks, even especially in my family, like extended family, when people realize they are on the spectrum, they're like, where do I go? And I'm like, where everybody else goes, TikTok. Like, I think those are great resources. And then, of course, if people wanted to engage with me directly, I'm on LinkedIn. Of course, I could interact with people there. I think those are great starts.
Amazing. All right. Well, thank you so much, LouAnne, for spending time with me today. This has been a wonderful conversation.
It's been great to connect with you.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. Well, thank you for joining us, Dr. LouAnne Boyd, again. We will see you next time. Hey, listeners, if you're enjoying the stories and insights from the Ashes, why not stay connected with our community? Join my mailing list for bi-weekly updates on upcoming events, wellness tips, fun tidbits, and of course, new podcast episodes. I promise no spam, just valuable content to help you live your best life. Head over to www.intrepidwellness.life and sign up today. Don't miss out, and let's keep the conversation going.